Beyond the Bony Labyrinths. Podcast on music and philosophy by Rondo Wq. Episode 16, Music and Melancholy 1. Emanuel Bach. This is the beginning of a curious composition by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, conversation between a sanguine and a melancholic person, Gespräch zwischen einem Sanguineus und Melancholicus. I am playing it on the piano, but it is actually a trio for two violins and a basso continua. One violin as the part of Melancholicus, the other that of Sanguineus. It can also be performed with one violin, says the composer. The harpsichordist then plays one of the violin parts. In more radical form, this piece is a demonstration of something I've discussed in previous episodes, the possibility that music, including instrumental music, speaks in a sense. More precisely, that it represents recognizable acts of speech. Nothing concrete is said, but there is a recognizable pattern of conversation. In this case, an amiable dispute. You might consider this an experiment. In his extensive commentary, the composer says he has made an attempt to express as much as possible something with instruments which is otherwise much more easily done with words and the singing voice. The intention is to depict a conversation between a Sanguineus and a Melancholicus who argue and try to convince the other. You might ask, why would anyone want to do such an experiment? If words and a singing voice are able to express something much more easily, why would you want to try to do the same thing in instrumental music? The composer does not elaborate on that. The answer might be, briefly, that feelings and sensations are not bound to words, and instrumental music, precisely because it is not dependent on a text, can express those feelings more freely. The paradoxical thing about this is that instrumental music owes its expressive power largely to the intonation patterns of the speaking and singing voice. It is precisely because of these patterns that we recognize a monologue or conversation in music, even when nothing is being said. Emanuel Bach has chosen a peculiar form for this experiment. For the composition does have the pattern of a dialogue, with questions, interruptions, rebuttals, and so on. But it is not the kind of music that most recognizably imitates dialogue, instrumental recitative. I discussed this in the previous episode. Instrumental recitative is usually a monologue, but there is no reason why you couldn't also use it in dialogue form. The music does not resemble recitative, and it is not typically vocal. The Sanguineus part is rather dance-like. Nevertheless, we can recognize musical phrases, and those phrases can be repeated, divided into segments, and interrupted. After the two interlocutors have first posed a more or less complete statement, slow and languorous for the melancholic, I just played that, and energetic for the Sanguineus, those sentences are broken off and interlocked, following the structure of a dialogue and in a more abrupt manner than is usual in music. An unsuspecting listener will feel compelled to seek an explanation for those abrupt transitions and contrasts. What is happening here? And even if you wouldn't know the title of the work, the obvious thing to think of is certain forms of behavior, talking behavior, in this case a dispute. The composer himself has explicitly listed all those patterns of behavior in an extensive commentary. He indicates exactly which stages this conversation goes through. That is a long list, numbered alphabetically from A to Z, and when the alphabet proved too short, he continued with double letters, from AA to R. Those elucidations are not in the score itself, and of course it is not the intention that someone reads those comments with the music, but for this occasion it can be enlightening to hear a bit of the piece with clarifications. However, the comments are too long for the music, they sometimes relate to very brief moments. I will therefore shorten them. I will have to play both violin parts on the piano. Of course, this does make the distinction between the two roles less clear, but together with the explanatory notes, I think it can be followed. The Melancholicus asks whether the other agrees with him. But the latter expresses a completely different opinion. The Sanguineus tries to entice the Melancholicus, but the latter falls back into his melancholy. The Sanguineus asks if the other wants to complete what is missing, but the latter again inserts a piece of his theme. Exasperated, the Sanguineus shows how he should have replied. The Melancholicus begins to give in, but very soon he has to recover from the effort. The Sanguineus mocks him. Here the Melancholicus follows the Sanguineus. And here I end a bit abruptly. We're still a long way from the end of the conversation, but already it seems as if the Sanguineus has won, and that could be called a weakness in the dramaturgy. It remains a remarkable experiment, even if, as a piece of wordless musical drama, it is not entirely successful. The composer states that he hopes his explanations will not provoke mockery. He could expect ridicule from those who think it is a violation of music to burden it with such concrete content. Yet it is difficult to take this piece seriously, even as an experiment. It has something of a farce about it, if only because of the caricatured portrayal of the melancholic, who falls asleep profoundly and gloomily. Tiefsinnig und finster. The piece is also an instance of humour in another sense of the word, the meaning that word has had since ancient times in medical theory. It then refers to bodily fluids, humores, the four substances blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To their action were attributed the four temperaments, the phlegmatic, choleric, sanguine, and melancholic temperament or character. Blood, sanguis, is dominant in the energetic, positive-minded sanguinicus. Black bile, in Greek melancholic, is responsible for the melancholic temperament. In Emanuel Bach's dialogue, a melancholic attitude is represented with musical patterns that we can associate with melancholic feelings. Slow, in minor, with short phrases and sighs. Seufzer. That melancholic expression we are supposed to attribute to a character in the play, one of the two partners in the dialogue. We will need to recognize that expression to understand the play, but it is not necessary, and probably not intended, that we ourselves adopt that mood, that we imagine ourselves in the role of melancholic. But it is not what you would usually expect when we talk about melancholic music. Then we characterize that music as melancholic because we recognize a mood in it that we can sympathize with, on which we can project any melancholic feelings and associations of our own. When a piece of music is merely melancholic and not the portrait of a melancholic, there is no person or character to which we can connect that melancholy. It is, as it were, free-floating, a feeling on the loose. It is not anyone's melancholy, not even the composer's, in principle. The contrasting moods in a sonata or suite are not a record of the composer's fluctuating soul life. Insofar as music speaks or expresses something, it is not making concrete, real assertions. Even if we recognize certain emotional values in it, it is not a composer's cry of heart. "Oh, I am so sad today." But this principle requires an exception in the case of Emanuel Bach. Perhaps. This is one of the best-known works by this lesser-known composer, and undoubtedly in the genre of the so-called free fantasia, it is the most famous. And that fame is partly due to the curious and telling title given by the composer, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bachs Empfindungen, Emanuel Bach's Feelings. The explicit linking of what a composition expresses to the composer's personal emotional life is of course only possible by means of words, through the title or an explanatory note, and not through the music itself. And that the title contains such an explicit self-reference is exceptional. In many other cases we may suspect that the composer wanted to express some very personal sentiment, but it is still our interpretation. That would be the case if the title had simply been Fantasia by C.P.E. Bach. That, by the way, is what is written over it in the manuscript of the original solo version. The title, Bachs Empfindungen, in the composer's own handwriting, is found on a somewhat peculiar second version with violin accompaniment. The original solo version is more successful because the violin part adds little of substance, and also because this is a free fantasia, a quasi-improvisation that has something of a spontaneous and a very private train of thought. The composer is guided by spontaneous ideas, often with abrupt transitions. Before this composition, before 1787, and long after, there is probably no piece of music that more strongly suggests a wordless thought process than this fantasia. It is a thought process in which the ideas are musical ideas, but those ideas can be linked to certain emotional values. Much of what goes on inside us cannot be put into words, or with great difficulty. Sensations, feelings, in German, Empfindungen. In a free fantasia, all kinds of Empfindungen can come up. This already happened in Father Johann Sebastian's chromatic fantasia, which I discussed in a previous episode. In its recitative, we find a succession of musical ideas that at the same time have the character of expressive speech acts, running through a whole range of feelings. There too a melancholic mood prevails, contrasting oddly with the bravura of the fast passages, another characteristic element of the free fantasia. Bachs Empfindungen is Emanuel Bach's last fantasia. As in other fantasias, there are sections without bar lines, a fast passage work fused with snatches of recitative, and some more melodic ideas. The gently pulsing chords of the recurring opening phrase sound like an accompaniment in search of a melody. It is less a statement than an idée fixe that seems to pop up involuntarily in different contexts. Sehr traurig und ganz langsam, very sadly and quite slowly, is written above the first bars in the version with violin. And in this case we have a more concrete clue as to the cause of that sadness. The piece can be interpreted with great probability as a meditation on the composer's own imminent death. This becomes clear when we realize that the beginning of this recurring, a more melodic passage corresponds to one of his sacred songs, entitled Andenken an den Tod, memento mori. The first lines of the text read, freely translated, "Who knows how near I am to death? Perhaps before this day is over, I will be withered like a leaf."
Wer weiß, wie nah der Tod mir ist. Vielleicht dieser Tag verfließt, vielleicht dieser Tag verfließt, bin ich verwelkt wie dürres Laub des Todes Raub, des Todes Raub, und mein Gebein bedeckt der Staub.
Death was indeed near. The Fantasia dates from 1787. Emanuel Bach died in December 1788. Without that information, we would probably not realize that this is a quotation. We find nothing like musical quotation marks. It is true, though, that a clear interruption, a contrast, can serve as such. A striking discontinuity. I talked about that in an earlier episode. This we find here too. The theme is introduced after a pause, in a new tempo and a new time signature. But such discontinuity is frequent in this fantasia. You can't say it marks the quotation as such. With that information, which we cannot get from the composition itself, and with knowledge of the title, the content or meaning of this fantasia becomes more concrete. And thus we also have an explanation for its melancholic character. Instead of a free-floating feeling or a mood, we are dealing here with a personal statement, anchored in the composer's life. There is another composition where Emanuel Bach refers to himself in the title, this time with a first-person pronoun. Abschied von meinem Silbermannischen Claviere. Farewell to my Silbermann Clavichord. Emanuel Bach wrote this piece when he sold his instrument in 1781. Why he got rid of it is not entirely clear, presumably it was money trouble. It was not his only clavichord. At his death he left 2 clavichords by other makers, a harpsichord and a fortepiano. But the Silbermann seems to have been particularly dear to him. Again, this is a very intimate piece, although its private character is tempered somewhat by the fact that it was intended for the buyer of that instrument. This buyer, an admirer of the composer called Baron Grothus, responded upon reception with a merry little dance, musically at least. That piece is entitled Joy on Receiving the Silbermann Clavichord. This is the beginning. If the Baron did not misjudge the situation, the farewell cannot have been so painfully tragic. Otherwise his joy would have been rather tactless. One would then expect maybe something like a sentimental humorous touch on Emanuel's part, but there is no trace of irony in the music. It is one of his most successful, empfindsam, tender works. More than the harpsichord, the clavichord is an intimate and domestic instrument, and Emanuel Bach's more expressive works, including Bachs Empfindungen, were therefore written primarily for this instrument. The musician-poet Daniel Schubart, a younger contemporary, speaks of the clavichord as that lonely, melancholic, inexpressibly lovely instrument that is ideally suited to expressing all nuances of feeling. Anyone who does not like banging, pounding, and rushing, whose heart pours out in tender feelings, will leave the harpsichord and fortepiano aside and choose a clavichord from a good maker. And thus Daniel Schubart. I will try, without pounding or banging, to let you hear a little more of that intimate farewell on the piano. The complete composition can be heard in the next episode, which is now also online. It is a short recital of melancholy music, including Bach's Empfindungen. I've only touched on the subject of melancholy in this episode. I want to continue next time and focus more on the complexity of what melancholy entails, and also on the special relationship that seems to exist between melancholy and what we experience as musical beauty. This was episode 16 of Beyond the Bony Labyrinths.